When we think of commercial airplanes disappearing without a single trace, our minds naturally drift toward the vast, uncharted expanses of the deep ocean. We think of the dark, bottomless waters of the Pacific or the mythical legends of the Bermuda Triangle. It makes logical sense to us that a multi-ton machine could easily vanish into a trench that is miles deep. But what happens when a fully loaded passenger airliner disappears not over a vast, empty ocean, but right over dry land? What happens when a routine flight vanishes right in the middle of a populated country, effectively evaporating into the thin air, leaving absolutely zero debris, zero radar tracks, and zero distress calls? Imagine boarding a short, entirely standard domestic flight. You expect to be on the ground, having dinner with your family in exactly 1 hour. The weather's normal. The airplane is fully functioning. The pilots are highly experienced veterans of the route. The aircraft takes off, climbs into the clouds, and is never seen again. No wreckage is found. No emergency beacons are activated. Helicopters and military planes spend weeks scouring the exact flight path, looking at every square mile of ground, but they find absolutely nothing. The airplane has simply been erased from reality. For the families left behind, it becomes an agonizing, open-ended nightmare. The rumors begin to circulate. Was it hijacked? Was it flown to a secret location? Did it ever really take off? This is not a Hollywood script. This is the exact chilling reality of SAETA Flight 011, an aircraft that flew into a cloud on a summer morning, vanished completely from the face of the earth, and successfully hid its dark, tragic secret from the world for 26 agonizing years. To truly comprehend the sheer impossibility of this mystery, we must first look at the machine, the men flying it, and the incredibly unforgiving environment they were operating in. The date was August 15th, 1976. The airline was SAETA, a regional carrier operating out of the South American nation of Ecuador. The aircraft sitting on the tarmac that morning was a Vickers Viscount, a very popular British-built four-engine turboprop airliner. By the standards of the 1970s, the Viscount was a proven, reliable workhorse of the skies. It was known for its distinctively large, oval-shaped passenger windows and a steady, rhythmic humming sound generated by its 4 Rolls-Royce engines. On this particular morning, 55 passengers and 4 crew members boarded the aircraft at the Mariscal Sucre International Airport in the capital city of Quito. Their destination was the city of Cuenca, located to the south. In terms of distance, it is an incredibly short flight. In a modern jet, it would take barely more than half an hour. But the invisible trap of this specific route lies entirely in what sits directly beneath the flight path. Ecuador is visually dominated by the Andes Mountains. This is not just a mountain range. It is one of the most violent, towering, and aggressively hostile geological formations on the planet. The Andes form a massive, jagged spine running down the continent, with individual peaks routinely piercing through the atmosphere at altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet. For an unpressurized or older turboprop aircraft from the 1970s, the Andes represent the absolute ultimate test of aviation skill. The weather patterns in these high-altitude valleys are notoriously unpredictable. A perfectly clear, sunny morning can instantly mutate into a blinding, zero-visibility whiteout in a matter of minutes as warm, moist air from the Amazon basin violently collides with the freezing glacial peaks. Flying through this region before the advent of modern GPS satellites meant relying heavily on dead reckoning, highly precise compass headings, a stopwatch, and absolute visual confirmation of the mountain passes. The men in the cockpit of Flight 011 were deeply familiar with these risks. They were veteran aviators who had navigated these exact treacherous corridors countless times. They knew the valleys. They knew the radio beacons. They knew the deadly nature of the rocks waiting inside the clouds. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, The four Rolls-Royce turboprop engines spooled up to maximum power. The aircraft accelerated down the high-altitude runway in Quito and lifted gracefully into the morning sky. The initial climb out was perfectly standard. Inside the local air traffic control center, the radio crackled with the familiar, routine voice of the SAETA captain. He reported his altitude, confirmed his heading southward toward Cuenca, and indicated that the aircraft was performing exactly as expected. He was instructed to report when he passed a specific navigation waypoint along the route. The controller acknowledged the transmission and waited. In an air traffic control room, a controller relies on a continuous, rhythmic flow of communication. An airplane hits a waypoint, the pilot calls in. The controller clears them to the next altitude. It is a highly choreographed digital dance. But as the minutes ticked by on the wall clock, the radio frequency dedicated to SAETA Flight 011 remained dead silent. 10 minutes passed. The controller picked up his microphone and requested an update from the aircraft. Nothing but the heavy hiss of static replied. He asked another aircraft flying in the same general sector to try reaching the Viscount on a relay frequency. The other pilot called out into the blind, asking for a radio check from Flight 011. There was absolutely no response. Down on the ground, a slow, deeply unsettling feeling of dread began to wash over the control room. The radar technology of the 1970s in this highly mountainous region was severely limited. Massive walls of granite and ice naturally block radar waves, creating massive digital blind spots. The aircraft had essentially flown off the edge of the radar coverage into a thick blanket of weather and ceased to communicate. There was no panicked mayday call. There was no frantic report of a failing engine, no mention of severe turbulence, no indication of a fire or a hydraulic failure. One moment the airplane existed flying straight and level, and the next moment it was simply gone. When an airliner goes missing over land, the immediate assumption is that a search and rescue operation will locate the smoking wreckage within a matter of hours. An airplane carrying nearly 60 people and thousands of gallons of highly flammable aviation fuel leaves a massive, undeniable scar on the earth when it crashes. It burns. It breaks trees. It leaves a long debris field of shattered aluminum. The Ecuadorian military, fully expecting to find the crash site quickly, launched one of the most extensive, highly coordinated aerial search operations in the nation's history. Squadrons of military helicopters and low-flying fixed-wing search planes took to the skies, methodically flying tight grid patterns over the entire known route from Quito to Cuenca. They searched the valleys, they scanned the dense green canopies of the cloud forests, and they flew incredibly close to the treacherous, snow-capped peaks of the Andes. But as the first few critical days passed, the horrifying reality of the Andean geography began to set in. Searching for an airplane in this specific environment is a logistical nightmare bordering on the impossible. The mountains are characterized by vertical, sheer rock walls, impossibly deep ravines, and massive, shifting glaciers. To make matters worse, the weather over the high peaks rarely clears. The search pilots were constantly fighting extreme turbulence, brutal downdrafts, and thick, soupy cloud cover that hid the mountains from view. The investigators mathematically calculated the aircraft's airspeed and fuel burn, trying to draw a precise circle on a map where the plane must have come down. But inside that circle were hundreds of square miles of completely inaccessible, utterly hostile terrain. You could fly a helicopter just a few hundred feet directly over a crashed airplane in these mountains, and if it had fallen into a deep glacial crevasse, or if it had been quickly covered by a fresh layer of heavy mountain snow, you would see absolutely nothing but a smooth, white, unbroken surface. Weeks turned into a month. The massive search operation had consumed thousands of hours of flight time and burned through enormous amounts of resources. The search teams had followed up on every single eyewitness report of a loud noise, every report of smoke in the distance. every rumor generated by remote mountain villages. Every single lead turned into a dead end. Eventually, the brutal laws of probability forced the government to make a deeply painful decision. The search was officially called off. SAETA Flight 011 was declared lost. For the families of the 55 passengers and 4 crew members, this was the absolute worst possible psychological outcome. When an airplane crashes and is found, there's profound grief, but there is also a physical finality. There is an explanation. But when a flight simply vanishes into the clouds and never returns, the human mind refuses to accept closure. In a vacuum of hard evidence, wild, elaborate theories immediately began to take root in the public consciousness. In the context of 1970s South America, an era deeply defined by intense political instability, military juntas, and guerrilla warfare, many people firmly believed the aircraft had been hijacked by a militant faction and flown to a secret jungle airstrip. Others whispered about the involvement of alien phenomena, claiming the plane had been snatched right out of the sky by a flying saucer. Still others theorized that a catastrophic explosive decompression had caused the aircraft to disintegrate so completely at high altitude that the pieces simply scattered like dust across the jungle canopy. For over 2.5 decades, SAETA Flight 011 became a dark, modern myth. It was a ghost story told by older pilots to younger pilots. It was a haunting local legend about a plane that flew into a cloud and simply ceased to exist in our dimension. The calendar pages turned. The 1970s gave way to the 80s, the 90s, and eventually a new millennium. An entirely new generation was born, and the world slowly, naturally forgot about the 59 souls who never made it to Cuenca. But nature has a highly specific, relentless timeline of its own. It is a clock completely detached from human emotion or memory. Fast forward 26 years to the end of 2002. A highly experienced team of extreme altitude mountaineers was making a grueling, dangerous ascent up the sheer, icy flanks of Mount Chimborazo. Chimborazo is a massive, inactive stratovolcano, and its peak is officially the highest point in Ecuador, soaring past 20,000 feet into the thin upper atmosphere. It is a permanently frozen, brutal environment of shifting ice, hurricane-force winds, and massive glaciers. As the climbers carefully navigated a treacherous section of a glacier on the eastern face of the towering volcano, an altitude of over 17,000 feet, one of them noticed something entirely unnatural breaking the pristine, endless white of the snow. It was a dull, heavily oxidized piece of green and silver metal protruding sharply from the dense glacial ice. In this extreme, isolated environment, where nothing man-made should exist, finding metal is an immediate shock to the system. As the climbers cautiously approached the object, the horrifying reality of what they were standing on began to reveal itself. Spread out across the massive, sweeping ice field, partially entombed inside thousands of tons of frozen water, were the undeniable, shattered remnants of a commercial airliner. They found heavy mechanical landing gear struts, deeply warped sections of an aluminum fuselage, twisted 4-bladed propeller hubs, and the scattered, frozen personal belongings of dozens of human beings. There were suitcases, vintage clothing, and perfectly preserved newspapers dated exactly August 15th, 1976. After 26 long, mysterious years, the massive stratovolcano had finally decided to give back the ghost plane. When a specialized high-altitude military recovery team eventually reached the crash site to secure the wreckage and recover the remains, aviation safety experts and investigators finally got the chance to answer the question that had haunted the country for a quarter of a century. How did a perfectly functioning airplane end up embedded inside a glacier at 17,000 feet without anyone ever knowing? The forensic analysis of the twisted metal, specifically the angles of the shattered propeller blades and the intense compression of the forward fuselage told a clear, devastating, and immediate story. The aircraft did not fall out of the sky due to a mechanical failure. The wings did not snap off in turbulence. The engines did not catch fire. The aircraft struck the side of the massive volcano at cruising speed in a relatively level, forward-flying attitude, with all four engines producing high thrust. This completely ruled out sabotage or an unrecoverable mechanical dive. What happened to SAETA Flight 011 is a textbook, tragic example of a phenomenon known in the aviation industry as controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT. Controlled flight into terrain is an incredibly paradoxical concept. It occurs when a perfectly healthy, completely flyable airplane, under the absolute control of a highly trained flight crew, is flown directly into the ground, a mountain, or the ocean, simply because the crew has completely lost their situational awareness. To understand how a veteran pilot could fly a screaming airliner directly into the side of a massive volcano, you must understand the psychological terror of flying in the clouds before modern computers. In the 1970s, airliners were not universally equipped with a ground proximity warning system. Today, if a modern jet flies too close to a mountain, a loud, aggressive robotic voice will scream, pull up terrain. But the SAETA crew had no such digital guardian. They were relying purely on a compass heading, an altimeter, a clock, and their own minds. On that morning in 1976, as the Viscount was navigating its way south, the massive bulk of Mount Chimborazo was entirely enveloped in a thick, impenetrable blanket of heavy clouds. The phenomenon of mountain flying is deeply deceptive. When an aircraft is engulfed in thick, milky white clouds, the human brain completely loses all sense of depth, speed, and spatial orientation. It is exactly like driving a car at high speed into a completely solid wall of white smoke. You have absolutely no idea what is 10 feet in front of your bumper. The pilots were likely slightly off their intended airway. A strong, unexpected high-altitude crosswind may have silently, gently pushed the heavy aircraft a few miles to the east of their correct navigation corridor without them ever noticing. In the days of purely analog instruments, a drift of just 2 or 3 miles meant the difference between flying cleanly through a valley pass and pointing directly at a solid wall of granite hidden inside a cloud. They were flying straight, level, and fast, believing they had thousands of feet of empty air below them. They never saw the mountain. They never had time to pull back on the yoke. The transition from a peaceful, routine flight to absolute kinetic destruction was instantaneous. There was no time to panic, no time to reach for the radio to scream mayday. The mountain simply absorbed them. But the final piece of the mystery, the haunting question of why the most extensive search and rescue operation in the nation's history failed to find a massive, shattered airplane, comes down to the brutal, majestic physics of a glacial environment. When the heavy airliner violently slammed into the steep, snow-covered face of Chimborazo, the incredible kinetic energy of the impact, combined with the acoustic shockwave of the exploding fuel, triggered a massive, instantaneous avalanche. Within seconds of the crash, hundreds of thousands of tons of fresh, heavy mountain snow and ice collapsed from the peaks above, crashing down and burying the shattered aircraft in a tomb that was dozens of feet deep. By the time the search helicopters arrived in the sector, just hours later, there was no metal to see. There was no fire, no smoke, and no debris field. The mountain had immediately, surgically erased all evidence of the tragedy, covering it in a flawless, pristine white blanket. For the next 2.5 decades, the aircraft was completely sealed inside the creeping, frozen heart of the mountain. But a glacier is not a stationary block of ice. It is actually an incredibly slow, moving river of frozen water, driven downward by the immense, unrelenting force of gravity. Over the span of 26 years, this slow, Geological conveyor belt quietly carried the crushed remains of the aircraft and its passengers down the side of the volcano. The ice slowly melted, shifted, and deformed until finally, perfectly matching the timeline of the new millennium, the mountains spit the wreckage out onto the lower snowfields, directly into the path of an incredibly lucky group of climbers. Today, commercial aviation operates at an almost mythical level of statistical safety. We sit in highly comfortable, climate-controlled cabins, perfectly connected to wireless internet, while massive satellites track our position in the sky down to the exact meter. We rely on ground proximity warnings, synthetic digital terrain maps on glowing screens, and complex autopilot algorithms designed to make controlled flight into terrain completely obsolete. But the chilling 26-year absence of SAETA Flight 011 serves as a profound, humbling philosophical warning. We have built incredible machines that can compress the globe, turning a treacherous mountain crossing into a simple, uneventful hour in the sky. We have convinced ourselves that our radar and our technology grant us absolute mastery over the Earth. But this tragic ghost story reminds us that nature is unimaginably vast, entirely indifferent, and infinitely powerful. It reminds us that our multi-million-dollar machines are incredibly fragile when placed against the silent, imposing authority of geology. A fully loaded passenger airliner can indeed vanish from the face of the Earth, not because of aliens or conspiracies or magical triangles in the ocean, but simply because our planet has the ability to easily swallow our greatest technological achievements in a single heartbeat, quietly hiding the terrifying truth under a perfect blanket of white ice, waiting patiently for decades until it finally decides to give her secrets back.